Alright, our final one. This one covers Chapter 23, Section 3, pages 554 to 559. You've read previously the war had been going on for a little over 3 years before the United States finally becomes involved in this, of April 1917. The United States declares war on Germany. It was about another 9-10 months, though, before any significant number of American troops actually showed up in Europe and were able to help the Allies. But when they did, that was really a game changer. It really showed Germany that America just represented all this kind of new, fresh manpower that would just keep coming in, plus all the supplies that the United States was bringing in to help the Allies. Germany was running out of manpower, military, food supplies, and they basically realized that they weren't going to be able to win this war, so they eventually signed the peace treaty and declared an end to the war. So this presentation is looking at the aftermath of the war. Losses and casualties. If you remember the term total war from back when we looked at the Civil War, it's the idea that it's not just the military that are affected, but the civilians, the everyday people as well. So total war means it mobilized all the resources, all the military, the industry, everyone in the areas of fighting were affected by this. It's estimated that about 65 million men from both sides fought in this particular war, which is just mind-boggling if you try to imagine 65 million. About 10 million men died on the battlefields. They estimate about another 20 million wounded, and that's not counting the civilian casualties, so just tremendous astronomical numbers as far as losses and casualties. The armistice, and an armistice is basically an agreement to stop fighting. The armistice was signed on November 11th. This should say 1918, sorry. And today is what we celebrate as Veterans Day. When it first happened, that day was celebrated as Armistice Day, and in Britain and France they called it Remembrance Day. But unfortunately, this war that was supposed to end all other wars wasn't the case, and we sadly had several more wars that came after this, so Congress eventually renamed Armistice Day to Veterans Day to represent the military from all the various wars that the United States has been involved in. So it's celebrated on November 11th every year. Other things happening in Europe after the war. The map of Europe is going to be totally withdrawn, and we'll look at the tremendous changes that happen there. European countries are just devastated. They're turned to rubble. As I said, millions of people have been killed or wounded. Their economies are destroyed. The picture's not the greatest thing, but it's just their towns are leveled, and now they have to rebuild. So the Paris Peace Conference was held. There were representatives from 32 nations that came together to basically iron out the terms of surrender. However, the defeated countries weren't involved in any of these negotiations. It was just the winners who were making all of these decisions. And the three most important men there were known as the Big Three. They were the leaders from Great Britain, the United States, and France. They were the ones that primarily ran the peace conference and pretty much made all the major decisions. And this took place in the Palace of Versailles, which is in France. Again, here are the main leaders of the conference. For France, you have Georges Clemenceau. He's the man in the middle there. He wanted Germany to really be punished very harshly. Most of the fighting on the Western Front happened in France, so France suffered terrible losses as well as, decimated cities. And France really wanted to stick it to Germany and really wanted to punish them and blame them totally for the war. In the United Kingdom, you had David Lloyd George, who's on the left side of your picture. He wanted Germany to pay reparations, which means basically you're going to foot the bill for the war. The war cost billions of dollars to these other countries, and you're going to pay us back for all the money we had to spend to fight you in this war. So they wanted Germany to pay reparations, and they were very concerned about retaining all their various colonies. The British had the largest empire in the world as far as colonization, and they wanted to make sure that they kept control of their colonies. And then lastly, you had Woodrow Wilson, who's on the right side of your picture. He again kind of termed the phrase, he saw the World War I as the war to end all wars. He wanted to make the world safe for democracy. He wanted what he called peace without victory. He didn't want Germany to be punished because he felt that that would just lead to more problems. So as you can see, these three men had very different ideas about how things should be settled, and it took them over 6 months to iron out all their differences and eventually come up with the treaties. Most people only know or talk about the Treaty of Versailles because it was the largest, because it dealt primarily with Germany, but as you can see, there were half a dozen other treaties signed with all the various nations that were involved in the war. But the Treaty of Versailles is the one, as I said, that most people only know about that one, and that's the one we're primarily going to look at because it had the greatest impact on basically the future and what's going to happen later in the world. So the Treaty of Versailles, some people called it revenge on Germany, again because they were very harshly punished for their involvement of the war. The treaty was designed to cripple the German military and to economically hurt Germany. They were forced to reduce their military. Their army could not have more than 100,000 men. They weren't allowed to have any tanks or airplanes. Their navy had to be reduced to very few ships. They weren't allowed to have any more submarines. So their military was drastically reduced. They just wanted to make sure Germany would never be in a position to start a war again. They lost a lot of their territory. We'll look at a map in a minute to show you some of the different areas that they lost. Their colonies overseas in Africa and Asia, they lost control of most of those. They had to accept blame for the war. They had to publicly say, we're sorry, we're the one that caused all of this pain and grief. And then lastly, they had to again pay reparations, billions and billions of dollars. Germany was going to be forced to pay the Allied countries for the losses that they had suffered. So the Treaty of Versailles really stuck it to Germany, and they were in a very bad place because of this. This shows you the map of what Germany looked like before. All the kind of darkish green and the black areas were all lands and parts of Germany that were taken away from them and given to other countries after the war. So the size of Germany was reduced as well. As I said, they lost all their colonies. You can see where some of their colonies were in Africa, and they lost control of all of that. It went to the various allied nations, kind of divided it up among themselves. Also, what came out of the Treaty of Versailles was the creation of the League of Nations, and it was meant to be an international organization that would keep peace and prevent war. We have something called the United Nations today that came out of World War II, and the League of Nations was supposed to kind of work on that idea that rather than fighting about your differences, if representatives from countries could come together in a peaceful environment and talk and debate and argue and kind of iron out their problems, this would prevent any of these future wars. So this was something that President Wilson was really pushing for and really wanted to happen. However, Germany wasn't allowed to be a part of the League of Nations. It had to prove that it was a peace-loving country and not a warring country, so they weren't even allowed to be part of the process. Kind of ironic. President Wilson had developed what became known as the 14 points, and they were literally 14 bulleted ideas that he got written into the Treaty of Versailles. And he basically looked at all the various issues that caused the war. Remember the main, M-A-I-N? He wanted new kind of rules in place that would prevent those things from ever happening again. So a couple of the points are about open diplomacy, no more secret treaties, no more alliances that will drag people in. He wanted freedom of the seas, no more submarines, shooting people unaware. So he wanted people to be able to travel on the seas peacefully, both in time of war and in time of peace. He wanted the various colonies, the people in the colonies, to be given their freedom. He wanted the idea of self-determination, and if you remember again back just prior to the Civil War area, that term popular sovereignty, let the people decide, he wanted that to happen in Europe as well, where these different ethnic groups should be allowed to decide, whether they wanted to be their own country and decide their own fate and not be forced into being taken over by somebody else. He wanted Poland to be its own country, and again, his most important point, number 14, was his idea of the League of Nations. He really thought that the League of Nations would be successful in stopping any kind of major war like we've just gone through for the last 5 years, and he really wanted to prevent that from ever happening again in the future. So he really fought for and got the League of Nations approved in the treaty. Problem was, nobody, it didn't please everybody. Everybody, again, had their own kind of issues, how they wanted things to turn out, and the Treaty of Versailles was just a lot of compromise, and nobody, was really that strongly in favor of it. Germany hated it, of course, because they were punished so harshly for it. France thought that the treaty wasn't hard enough, that Germany should be getting it even worse than they were. Great Britain was very afraid that this was going to cause such hard feelings with Germany that eventually another war is going to come about. And that's very prophetic from Great Britain, because that's exactly what's going to happen about 20 years later. And in the United States, President Wilson had to get the Senate to approve. Senate has to vote on and approve any kind of treaties that the United States might sign. And the Senate was against the idea of the League of Nations because they felt that once again, the United States might get pulled into problems in Europe, and they didn't want us to be involved in any more wars over there. So he basically started touring the whole United States trying to convince the American people that the League of Nations was a good thing, put pressure on your senators to vote for it, and he was so stressed out by this whole situation that he eventually had a stroke. And his last few months in office, he was basically kind of physically unable to do anything, and his wife kind of ran things. Some people joke that Mrs. Wilson was the first woman president because she kind of ran the White House because her husband wasn't physically able to. So she kind of ran things for the country, but he was never able to get the Senate to approve of the League of Nations. So although the League of Nations did exist, and they did meet, the United States was never a part of it. So if you don't have the strongest country in the world as part of your organization, it really didn't last too long, and it wasn't very successful. Again, Germany's reaction to the treaty, the German people were outraged. They felt it wasn't fair to blame them for everything. Remember, it was Serbia who fired the shot and killed the Archduke, and it was Austria-Hungary that declared war and kind of started the whole thing, and Germany got pulled into it because of the alliances. So they didn't feel it was fair that they were being blamed for everything, and that they were being, again, punished so harshly. They lost 10% of their land, which meant they lost 12% of their population. The reparations were just too much. The country, again, was decimated by the war as well. Land and buildings destroyed, lives lost. Their economy was in a mess, in a shambles, and they didn't have billions of dollars sitting around so that they could repay people. So Germany was really upset by the Treaty of Versailles, and it was that anger that lasted for years and years and is eventually going to lead to the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler, which eventually is going to lead to World War II. So when you get into Part B of the U.S. History class, you'll be reading more about that. But just remember, it all came from the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles. And that's a picture there of the German people kind of protesting the treaty. They didn't have any choice, though. They were forced to sign it. The losers don't get to decide what happens to them. The winners do. So again, the impact, eventually they fell behind on their reparation payments, so now they're in debt to all these European countries for billions of dollars. Said their economy never kind of got back on track. And again, they blamed the treaty, and they blamed primarily France and Britain and the United States for all of their troubles. And one of the most important changes that came about from World War I was the map of Europe. This is what Europe looked like in 1914, prior to the start of the war. You can see these large countries, the Central Powers in the middle, the Allies surrounding them, Britain, France, Russia, the neutral countries. That's what Europe looked like in 1914. Now take a look at it. This is after the war. And if you pause and go back and kind of switch back and forth, you can see the tremendous change in what Europe looked like starting in 1919. Over a dozen new countries were created. But again, all these kind of nationalistic problems, Germany's dissatisfaction, all these things that are going to come out of the Treaty of Versailles are eventually what's going to lead the world into World War II, and that's when we started to number the wars, when the second one started in the 1936 with Germany declaring war on everybody and on World War II starting. So remember these maps.